Okay, everyone. So I'm going to do something a little bit different on today's video. So I'm joined by Mal, who's also a part of the AaronFire.com team. And we're going to talk a little bit about expat life because a lot of people have requested more information about that. So to start with, we're going to also talk about living in Japan as an expat, but also from a Japanese perspective, living overseas as an expat. So if we start with Japan and kind of living in Japan, what would you say are some of the challenges that expats will face living in Japan, especially if we're to compare like a big city like Tokyo to like a smaller place where there's less foreigners around?
Well, the biggest challenge is the culture difference is big, I think, and the customs are really big thing too. I mean, if you go to smaller town, then Japanese people are quite a bit close-minded. And then if you don't know how to react to Japanese people, like say if you hug to others, all of a sudden the Japanese people get really scared, right? Like we bow and like greet nicely. That's the thing. So in Tokyo, more like people are coming, so people get used to more people. But in smaller town, then people may get not familiar with the people from the outside, right? So if you go to a smaller town, then you should be more polite and a little bit, you should know the Japanese language too, I think.
Sure. Yeah, that's a good point because I think a lot of people think that people in Japan can't speak much English, but actually these days, in Tokyo especially, but also in some other big cities, the number of people who speak English is much larger than before, right? Especially in the richer parts of Tokyo. I think it's much better than people expect, but people in general are a little bit reserved, a little bit shy about using it sometimes, but people can kind of get by, right, as a tourist. But in the smaller places, the number of people speaking is very small, right? So maybe if you're a tourist, you can go to the tourist information or obviously in hotels or whatever. But if you're actually living on the ground, then obviously it's not easy to kind of get by, right, without at least some Japanese, I guess.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Sure. And in terms of like cost of living, a lot of people also stereotype Japan as being a particularly expensive place for expats to live. Obviously, the difference between like the local cost of living and some of the expat services is a little bit different. But you lived overseas before, right? Would you say when you lived overseas, did Japan seem cheap or expensive compared to the places you lived in?
It's really difficult to say because I was living in near London, so it was really expensive. But if you go to Tokyo, that is very expensive too. But if you go to kind of outside Tokyo, or let's say like in Chiba or Kanagawa prefecture, then that's much cheaper. And yeah, like cost of living is cheaper if you go to more countryside, but it's kind of difficult to find a good job. So I don't know which one is good.
Sure. Well, that's the point, right? I think a lot of people think Japan's especially expensive, but probably these days it's similar to most developed countries, right? So you mentioned like if you compare Tokyo to London, maybe it's comparable. And if you compare the smaller places in Japan to maybe the smaller places in the UK, it's comparable. So I think for a lot of people, if they've come from developed, expensive countries, I think a lot of them would think Japan's relatively similar to where they come from, right? But obviously, if somebody's coming from an underdeveloped country, including expats, maybe it will seem expensive, right? But I think back in the 1980s, during the bubble years of the Japanese economy, Japan was especially expensive, right? It was much more expensive than New York and London. So I think those days have maybe gone. It's comparable now.
Mhm.
Okay,
Yeah.
and what about from the other side then, from the point of view of Japanese expats, like living outside of their own country? I mean, I met many when I was in Southeast Asia and China, but what would you say are the challenges for Japanese people moving overseas, apart from maybe something like the language?
Yeah, well, as you said, the language is the biggest part for us, right? And I don't know, we are quite shy people, so it's kind of difficult to make friends outside or not very outgoing. So we need more like so outgoing mind. I don't know. That is the thing. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, that's very useful. Thanks for your time there, Mel. We'll do this again with some
Thank
of the other
you.
staff members.
Yeah.
And I hope that
Thank
was
you
also
very much.
useful for everyone.